students, how are you? I hope you are having a very happy weekend. So, as we talked in class, I'm going to provide a brief summary of our upcoming units and writers, so you have enough time to have a context for the readings and for the upcoming presentations. We were talking the other day about this new wave that was the Romantic period, that originated in Germany and that quickly spread to England and France and beyond, and it reached the United States around the 1820s. And we were saying that that was 20 years after William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge had revolutionized English poetry by publishing lyrical ballads. And so in United States, as in Europe, um, the Romantic movement provided a new, fresh, and new vision that electrified artistic and intellectual circles of the time. However, if we compare the European and the United States Romantic movement, there was an important difference. Romanticism in the United States coincided with a period of a national expansion and the discovery of a distinct U.S. voice. And so that was this parallelism with the need of a national identity, and the surging idealism and passion of Romanticism really nurtured the most of these writers that have been labeled the promoters of what is being called, quote, the American Renaissance, end quote. So romantic ideas center around art as an inspiration, a spiritual and aesthetic dimension of nature, and the metaphors of organic growth. And so art, rather than science, romantic argued, could best express universal truth. Because as we talked in class, that was really a reaction to the Enlightenment period. So the Romantics underscored the importance of expressive art beyond the individual and society. And I mentioned in class this extract from the essay The Poet, written by our first upcoming writer from the Transcendentalist movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he wrote in 1844 this poem that for some scholars really asserts the romantic spirit in the United States. He says, quote, for all men and women, as we always say that we provide a gender perspective, for all men live by truth and stand in need of expression in love, in art, in avarice, in politics, in labor, in games. We study to utter our painful secret. Man is only half himself. The other half is his expression. So we were commenting the other day also how we see one of the biggest differences with Enlightenment is the focus on expression rather than communication. And so the development of the self became this major theme, right? So now romantics talk about self-awareness as a primary method. And so according to romantic theory, self and nature are one. So self-awareness was not a selfish dead end, but a mode of knowledge open up to the universe. If oneself was, they argue that if oneself were one with all humanity, then the individual had a moral duty to reform social inequalities and relieve human suffering. So the idea of the self, which suggested selflessness to earlier generations, such as the Puritans, was now redefined in Romantic U.S. And now we have new compound words with positive meanings, that emerge in this time: self-realization, self-expression, self-reliance. As the unique subjective self became important, so did the realm of psychology. So exceptional artistic effects and techniques were developed to evoke heightened psychological states. here one of the most important concepts is that of the sublime. And if I were to ask you, how would you describe sublime? Probably it, you would have experienced it in so many different ways, all of them, of course, very valid. But trying to find a closest common definition, and correct me if you don't agree, it would be something like an effect of beauty in grandeur. For example, like a view from a mountain top. And so the sublime really produces feelings of awe and reverence and vastness and a power beyond human comprehension. So Romanticism was affirmative and appropriate for most U.S. poets and creative essayists, because American vast mountains and deserts and tropics, all these amazing landscape really embodied the sublime. And so the romantic spirit seemed particularly suited to US democracy because it stressed individualism, it affirmed the value of the common person, and looked to the inspired imagination for the aesthetics and the ethical values. So certainly the New England transcendentalists that which is going to be focusing on Ralph Waldo Emerson, but also, highly recommended, and of course we will talk a little bit about it, Henry Day Thoreau, also Margaret Fuller. They were inspired to a new optimistic affirmation of this romantic movement. And so in New England, Romanticism really fell upon this fertile soil. So we're going to, in these short explanations, I'll start with Transcendentalist movement that was a reaction against 18th century rationalism, and also a manifestation of this general sorry, it seemed like it was going to be cut. Sorry. So I was saying that is a manifestation of the general humanitarian trend of the 19th century thought. And so it's a movement that was based on fundamental belief of the unity of the world and God and the divine. So as I mentioned when we were talking about Native Americans, these the Emerson concept that I'm going to briefly introduce about the upper soul is the closest to this symbiotic relationship that all that is alive and all the ecosystems and feeling that you are part of something greater than yourself. And it is this the life spirit that is a divine reflection of its own divine creation that permeates all. And so the soul of each individual, according to transcendentalists, was thought to be identical with the world and with the universe. And so it was like a microcosm of the world and of the cosmos in itself. And so the doctrine of self-reliance and individualism really developed through the belief of the identification of the individual soul with the divine. And so transcendentalism was intimately connected with Concord, a beautiful landscape and a beautiful suburban area. It was a village, a small New England village, 32 kilometers west of Boston. And so actually that was the first inland settlement of the original Massachusetts Bay Colony, and of the first wave of Puritans. Is a place surrounded even today still by forest. And it was, and Concord in particular, was and it remains a very peaceful town, close enough to Boston lectures, bookstores, and colleges. So it's intensely cultivated, but it's far enough away to be serene and to be harmonious in itself. So actually Concord was a site also of the first battle of the American Revolution, and Ralph Emerson there was a poem about him that commemorates this battle, and it's called "The Conquered Hymn." And it's actually one of the most famous opening stanzas in U.S. literature. It says something like, quote, "By the root bridge that arch the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard around the world," referring to also the dimension that we saw in class about Thomas Paine understanding of the American Revolution as the cause of humanity in itself, the opportunity of humanity to um, to um, um, rule over and to win over systematic oppressive systems of power. So Concord, as I said, was his first rural artist colony, and it is the first place to offer somehow a spiritual and a cultural alternative to this new U.S. materialism, capitalism, um, and it was a place of high-minded conversation and simple living. Emerson and Thoreau both had their own vegetable gardens, and they had their hands. And Emerson, who moved to Concord in 1834, and Thoreau are most closely associated with the town, but also Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, lived there. Even the feminist writer, Feminist Fuller, also lived there. So many. They actually were part of what they call the Transcendentalist Club. That was somehow loosely organized in 1836 and included at various times Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, Channing, Alcott, Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist and a minister. Many intellectuals and celebrities, forward-thinking celebrities of the time. And the transcendentalists, they did not actually call themselves transcendentalists. That was a label that it was the same as it started with the Puritans, intended to be somehow derogatory and negative, but they resignified it, and they, I mean, ever since it's been associated with the movement. So Transcendentalism published a quarterly magazine that was called The Dial, that lasted for 4 years, and it was first edited by Margaret Fuller and later by Emerson. And so reform efforts engaged them as well as the literature, because all of them were very active in the anti-slavery movement, in the women's movement, in the movement of the against animal cruelty. And actually they were involved in experimental utopian communities, such as the nearby Brook Farm, that is actually described in Hawthorne's in one of his novels that is called Bitherley Romance, and also in another community, utopian community, that was called Fruitlands. But unlike many European groups, the Transcendentalists never actually issued a manifesto. They insisted on individual differences, on the unique viewpoint of the individual, and so they really pushed this radical idea of individualism to the extreme. They often, U.S. writers often saw themselves as these lonely explorers of society and convention. We talked about it in class, how the American hero, like the one that we're going to see, not this year because you're not reading Moby Dick the Whale, but Herman Melville, Captain Ahab, or Mark Twain, Huck Finn, or Edgar Allan Poe, many of his characters, they typically face this risk or even certain destruction in their own pursuit somehow of physical self-discovery in a way. And so for the for what is considered the romantic American writer, nothing was really a given, right? Literary and social conventions, far from being helpful, were actually dangerous. There was tremendous pressure to discover an authentic literary form. This is what I've been telling you about. They're finding their own unique voice, breaking completely from European tradition. And so they really wanted to discover an authentic literary form, an authentic content. And so it is clear from the many masterpieces produced in the 3 decades before the US Civil War, so from 1861 to 65, that the Civil War was in 1861-65. The U.S. writers really rose to the challenge, and so we're going to be. I'm going to be briefly introducing first Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was this towering figure of his era, and he really had a religious sense of mission. In that sense, he was very much like Jonathan Edwards, although many accuse him of really subverting Christianity. He explained that for him, quote, to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the church and work. He was complaining that the church acted like it was completely separated from the suffering of that was going on in the new suburbs and on the streets, right? And also with the slavery movement. So actually he addressed the addresses he delivered in 1838 at his alma mater, that was Harvard Divinity School, made him unwelcome at Harvard for 30 years because he accused the church of acting, quote, as if God were dead, unquote, and of emphasizing dogma while stifling the spirit. So Emerson's philosophy has been, in a way, contradictory, because it is true that he consciously avoided building a logical intellectual system, and that's why they never wrote a manifesto. Because for him it was all the time this romantic belief in intuition and flexibility that was completely the opposite of a systematized dogma, right? And actually, in his essay that is called Self-Reliance, he remarks that, quote, a foolish consistency is the hobbling of all little minds, unquote. Meaning that, he's remarkably consistent in his call for the birth of U.S. individualism inspired by nature. But at the same time, his own idea of self-reliance was not well understood at that time. Most of his major ideas are this, motivation to find a new national vision, and also the need to use personal experience, and of course the notion of the cosmic oversoul, and the doctrine of the compensation, which is very much based on Eastern understanding of the karma. And all this is suggested in his first publication, that's titled Nature, that was published in 1838. The essay opens this way. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sculptures of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry of insight and not a poetry of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? So, this idea that I mentioned in class, like we've been talking about how the United States was claiming independence geographically, economically, politically, and the last claim was from Western and particularly European tradition and British tradition, the right to have an independence of their soul and in their spirit. Actually, his spiritual vision and his practical expression made Emerson really acceleration, because he's a lot of he was so moving in the way he expressed things, and in the sense of somehow the force of this new fresh vision, right? That a lot of people compare listening to him with, quote, going to heaven in a swim, unquote. But much of his spiritual insight really comes from his readings of Eastern religion, especially Hinduism, Confucianism, Islam, and Islamic Sufism. For example, there is a poem that is called Braham that relies on Hindu sources to really assert a cosmic order beyond the limited perception of morals. And when this poem was published, that it was published first in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in 1857, it really confused the readers unfamiliar with Brahma, that is the highest Hindu god, the eternal, infinite soul of the universe in a Hindu tradition. And so Emerson, in order to help his readers understand this poem, he advised his readers, quote, tell them to say, well, he's actually to the editor-in-chief of the journal, quote, tell them to say Yahweh instead of Raham, unquote. He was, he wasn't referring to the idea of one cosmic force that takes many different forms and many different more names, but in the end is one same root and one same energy. So I mean, he has been a really influencing figure, and for many future writers and poets, United States, European alike. The most important, some critics really say that the most important writings in English in the 19th century had been Wordsworth's poems and Emerson's essays. So he was a really great prose poet, that it was influenced, as I said, it has influenced a long line of US poets, including Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Wallace Stevens, Hart Crane, Robert Frost, all of them that you will get to know them in following subjects. And he's actually also credited with influencing the philosophies of John Dewey. I don't know if you know him, very forward-thinking mind and philosopher in education at the turn of the 20th century, and also Nietzsche and William James. So after that, I will be talking about Edgar Allan Poe before Nathaniel Hawthorne. And so, of course, when we did this introduction about romanticism, we talked about how, it has to do with understanding human psyche and human emotions, and the human subconscious. And so in that way, Edgar Allan Poe, he's actually a Southerner, as one big difference in relation to other writers in class, because we've been focusing on New England writers. So actually shares with the biggest romantic names of the time, as Melville, Moby Dick's writer. They really share this darkly metaphysical vision that is mixed with realism, but at the same time, parody and the burlesque. He is an amazing pioneer and groundbreaking figure in the sense that he really refined the short story genre and invented new genres such as the detective fiction. And many of his stories really prefigure other genres such as science fiction, horror, and fantasy that are so popular today. Um, Poe, short and really tragic life was plagued with insecurity. Like so many other major 19th century American writers, he was orphaned at a very early age. And he Poe had this strange marriage in 1835 to his first cousin, Virginia Clan, who was not yet 14. That has been interpreted as an attempt to find this stable family life he lacked. Um, and Poe believed that strangeness was an essential ingredient of beauty, and I think this is really what characterizes the romantic Gothic in the United States. As I said, this idea that strangeness was an essential ingredient of beauty. And in his writing, he is often exotic. His stories and poems are really populated with doom and introspective aristocrats. Because actually, like many Southerners, he cherished an aristocratic ideal. So he was Hamiltonian, right? Um, and so we have these gloomy characters that never seem to work or socialize. And instead, they bury themselves in these dark modeling castles. They are symbolically decorated with bizarre rags and draperies that really hide the real world of the sun and windows and walls and floors. The hidden rooms always reveal um, ancient libraries, strange artworks, and eclectic Oriental objects. We have these aristocrats that are playing musical instruments or really read ancient books while they root in tragedies, often the deaths of loved ones. And so the theme of death in life, especially being buried alive or returning like a vampire from the grave, really appear in many of his works, including the premature burial Ligeia, the cast of the Amontillado, the fall of the House of Usher. And so Poe's twilight realm between life and death and his these gothic settings are not just married. They're not just decorations. They're not merely decorative. They really are. They reflect the over serialized yet deadly interior of his characters' disturbed psyches, because they are somehow symbolic expressions of the unconscious, and thus they are central to his art. And also, of course, he's a great poet, and also like many other Southerners, he's very musical and he's strictly metrical. His best known poem in his own lifetime and in his own lifetime, and even today, is The Raven, that it was written in 1845. Here also we see the haunted, sleepless narrator who has been reading and mourning the death of his, quote, lost Leonore, unquote, at midnight, and is visited by a raven. And it's a bird that eats dead flesh, hence can be considered as a symbol of death, and who perches about his door and ominously repeats the poem's famous refrain, nevermore. And then the poem ends in a frozen scene of death in life. Um, and so Poe's stories, such as those cited above, have been really described as tales of horrors. And the horror tales really prefigure works such as U.S. authors of horror fantasy as H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King. Um, And also, like for example, his tales that are described as detective fiction also precede other detective writers. And all the stories really reveal Poe's fascination with the mind and the unsettling scientific knowledge that was radically secularizing the 19th century worldview. Um, and in every genre, Poe explores the psyche. Profound psychological insights really gleaned throughout the stories. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Unquote. We read in the Black Cat. That's another of his stories. And to explore the exotic and strange aspect of psychological process, Poe really develop into accounts of logical processes and delve into accounts of madness and extreme emotion. So the painful that the deliberate state. Hold on. Oi,